So that's a kind of hurdle that we have to deal with. Or a woman who comes and says, according to my religion, it says my husband can beat me, but how many times can he beat me? So we're kind of working with that kind of thinking. And then this gets complicated because, particularly in the case of violence in spousal relationships, historically, this is not necessarily always true, and it's changing with the demographic changes, but historically, South Asian women have usually come here as sponsored spouses. So a man who has already been living here will go back to South Asia, get married, sponsor his spouse who comes here, and then because of immigration laws, etc., he is considered responsible for his spouse, and if there's certain breakdown in the relationship, she will get sent back to the country because if he no longer sponsors her. So this complicates something that's already set in motion to some extent by culture, where you obey the men in your family, your father, your husband, your brothers, and then if there's this additional threat that, if you decide or you feel this is an untenable situation, the only thing that's going to happen is that you're going to get sent back, and you may not want to get sent back for a variety of reasons, shame to your family, you see that life here offers opportunities perhaps that you would not have back home. So it's a sort of complicated mix of community, family, state laws, etc., that maintain or help maintain women in situations of violence. So the state, in terms of promoting or instigating violence, has set up laws that make it very difficult for women to go and complain. On the other hand, there are laws that talk about violence, and if you can get things like stay orders, etc. But then what that means is you have to access the courts, you have to access the legal system, and already if there are issues of culture and language and community and family pressure, these things become harder to do, or emotional kinds of pressures.
So the Prisoner Correspondence Project, we look at violence sort of on two levels. The first is the role of policing and gender-based violence leading up to incarceration, and how gender non-normativity is policed in various ways, like being transgender. Not only are you targeted by police for being on the street, taking up public space, maybe engaging in what we were saying, sex work, public sex. Being non-gender normative is criminalized because homelessness is criminalized, and how racial violence and poverty all intersect with gender to create further targeting of these communities leading up to incarceration, which is what we've been talking about a lot. But it also raises the second question of how the prison system itself involves gender violence, which I'm going to talk to mainly, I think, right now, because we sort of, as the Prisoner Correspondence Project, look at how gender violence happens inside. And I think it happens both on an official level, in the way that prisons are gendered, the way that people are housed in prisons is gendered, and so just the very act of being incarcerated, if you're transgender or non-gender normative, is going to be enforced by the actual system. Same with being queer. Like, if you're queer and put in prison and you hold hands with somebody, that very act of intimacy, even though it's just like a friendly token or like an expression of being queer, is going to be met both with official violence, so the ways in which that's an actual criminal act in prison, but also the ways in which if you're being openly gender non-normative or openly queer in prison, those things are policed not only through the official sanction of the institution itself, right, but also through violence. And so how is violence used both on an institutional level, like by laws and guards and criminalization within and outside of prison, but how gender is policed, like, and turned into violence by peer-to-peer violence. So say I'm like having sex with somebody of the same gender, guards could beat me, that's one level of violence. Another level is the peers could beat me. That's another level, and the guards don't intervene. So what to do, like when the violence is peer-to-peer and there's no grievance process. Like we've had situations where pen pals have written in and said, I'm being beat up by the guards, I'm filing complaints officially, and nobody is responding. There's no legal action, there's no recourse. And how violence happens on all of those levels. And a concrete example of this, I think, is HIV/AIDS. Like you were saying before, about how HIV/AIDS allows this kind of violence to happen on different levels. So there's the lack of access to clean gear. So if you don't have clean needles, you can seroconvert in prison. There's the criminalization of being trans and of queer sex. So the idea that if condoms themselves are criminalized, there's no access to like safer sex and spaces for safer sex, right? Because even if you do have condoms, like how do you have the opportunity to prepare and have condoms with you when you have an opportunity to sneak and have sex? And also sexual violence in prisons, there's a lot of that. So sex may not be consensual always. And all these issues conflate and target populations who are already targeted in the first place to be put in prison, who are now being set up in epidemic proportions to have HIV. And on top of all of that happening, there's also lack of access to other things like education. And so on top of that, another structure of violence that double intersects is the way in which people are being denied access to support, right? So you're in the system where you're facing violence for gender, you're facing violence in terms of sex, in terms of HIV/AIDS, access to resources, access to care, and then the people that you would need to have in your communities, other trans people who are incarcerated, other queer people who are incarcerated, people who have information about HIV/AIDS and health, are being kept apart from you. So often, like, people are put in protective custodies for being queer in prison or for being transgendered. Like, you're trans, you have to be isolated in your own cell. Slower? Sorry. So people are being isolated from other people, and isolation is itself a form of violence. And so the ways in which keeping people apart from each other, keeping people isolated is a violent act, and how we as a project see our role in intervening as trying to build these communities back together, both inside of prisons by providing support between prisoners, and by putting people who are queer and gender non-normative and transgender in contact with people on the outside who can also provide a means of support around HIV/AIDS and around prevention. And there is, like, talking to historical examples, like there's a very rich history of these kinds of things happening, where people in prison came together, like since the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and said, listen, like, we are going to start organizing informally since we're not allowed to do it officially. So in prison yards and breaks, people came together and said, listen, we have to start talking about HIV/AIDS, we have to start talking about the way that people with HIV/AIDS are treated, the ways that infirmaries are not providing any decent treatment. People started organizing, and then that started becoming a formal process sometimes, and then it would be broken up and happen informally again. And so though violence does exist, there has always been informal resistance to it. So talking about those histories, I think, is really important as well.
And I'm just going to speak very briefly to the role that the state plays in this picture. And I think one thing that's important to note is that in terms of, like, queer and trans prisoners, a lot of measures that are supposed to protect them actually end up producing more violence. And this kind of raises the question as to why these measures exist in the first place. So as Marty has already mentioned, like, protecting prisoners from transphobic or homophobic violence actually leads to putting them in protective custody. So like they're in isolation 23 hours a day without any resources or programming. And also in terms of, like, protecting, and this is the language used by Correctional Services of Canada, like, protecting prisoners from HIV transmission leads to the quarantine and segregation of HIV positive prisoners. And lastly, like, the prevention of sexual violence is actually really problematic because it's basically organized around punitive measures. So like after the fact, trying to gather evidence and prosecute the person responsible for the assault. And this is a problem because it expands criminal prosecution mandates and opens up the survivor to greater assault. And this becomes like a cyclical process where the violence is produced at each level, and the problem of like why and how these assaults happen in the first place is never really addressed. And so these are just some of the ways that measures that are supposed to like protect prisoners from violence actually end up just being like produce more violence.